what Hugging Face ended up doing is using open source model Kimi 3 to figure out what happened and basically try to stop this attack.
It's a model breach which got detected and contained pretty quickly.
How is this money going to come back to the company? That is a question that everybody seems to be focused on.
It's not a difficult answer. In a very simplistic way, your revenues through the cloud usage.
You may not necessarily rely on Google's AI offering.
And there's a lot of work being done in even the routing layer, optimizing it for cost control, right?
All right, and we're live. Venkatesh, welcome back. How's it going?
Great. Dhaval, how are you? Always happy to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, another super exciting week.
Yeah.
About 100 different stories and news lines that have come out in the past week that we'll try to pull together in about 30 minutes. Let's see how we do.
Yeah.
I think what I've tried to do is basically combine everything into one or two, high-level storylines. We'll go through that. And as we do that, we'll touch on a lot of different headlines and a lot of different individual stories. So basically, from an enterprise perspective, you sort of get a view of what's happening in the market. So we'll try to do our best and cover as much as we can. But I wanted to just start with that disclaimer that the goal isn't to dive in deep into each story, but rather present an interesting perspective and describe what's happening.
And we can go deep if any listener wants us to go deep. So that's what we would expect on the comment section saying, on this particular topic, if anybody wants us to go deep, we can, right? Either on the business side, technical side, finance side, or any of those aspects, right? So, yeah.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah. And let us know, feel free to DM us on social media or put a comment in this video. And we're happy to have longer discussions and be more insightful. Yeah. But with that, so the two main headlines this week were picking up from last week, this focus on open source models and what's happening with, open source sort of clashing with the closed source frontier models that we have. And then the second is just it's earnings season. So we're learning a lot about these hyperscalers and how they're sort of deploying their infrastructure, their, Google and Amazon, how they're sort of starting to accrete value and what that means for, the future. So those are the two main storylines that I think we'll explore today.
Absolutely. That's great.
Okay. So with that, let's get into the first story. I think this is a interesting starting point for what's happening in the market. About 10 days ago, we learned that this major enterprise called Hugging Face, it's basically a large, data scaler, storage repository for data, was hacked. And they tried to sort of track what happened. And we learned that the hack actually came from a friendly, right? From one of our own labs that had a model that figured out a way to escape its own guardrails, its own sandbox, and get into the Hugging Face system, because it was given a task that it was trying to solve. And where the open source really comes in is Hugging Face tried to figure out what was happening. They were trying to analyze this attack. And in doing so, they used, obviously, Anthropic models. They used OpenAI models. And all of those frontier models, they may be more capable, but they basically said, oh, this looks like cyber attack, cyber security, where we have guardrails to not deal with that issue. And basically, couldn't answer the question. And what Hugging Face ended up doing is using open source model Kimi 3 to figure out what happened and basically try to stop this attack. Yeah. So that's a really interesting data point, right? Where
Absolutely. The key thing I would add to everything that you said is the Hugging Face actually detected and contained it pretty quickly. So that entire process that you mentioned, that what they tried and then they went to Kimi at the end, all that happened at a very rapid pace. So that's the good part amongst the, if anybody is nervous about, oh my God, the open model got hacked, or, there's a safety risk. It's a model breach which got detected and contained pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Again, through an open model, right? That's the key.
So yeah, I mean, technically, the model that attacked is a frontier model, right? It's a closed source model. But yeah, I mean, Hugging Face did an incredible job protecting the data. By the way, none of the user data was exposed. None of the, everything is secure. Basically, the attack was on the internal systems. So without going too much, too much into details, the company did an excellent job protecting itself. But the conversation is really about these capabilities, right? We want to be secure. We want to be safe. But the frontier labs are holding back. They're basically saying, no, we can't give you the highest level of capability. And then Hugging Face actually had to go to an open source model to get that capability.
Exactly.
That's a really interesting perspective. And basically at the end of the day, of this reliance on the open source model to combat this kind of an attack because it doesn't have guardrails. I think that's a really important lesson for enterprises to learn, right?
Absolutely. I mean, enterprises have to look at, like they always do, look at the marginal risk, look at the absolute risk, and then see which is more that you have to put the guardrails on what aspect and what do you use for doing the same thing, right? So open models are lower cost. I mean, definitely there will be a need for them to use it, and they should use it, right? And the risk is not really only is because of the open model, right? It is because of the guardrails that you have implemented or not implemented, right? That's the way I would say that the enterprises need to think rather than saying no open models. I think that's not the right way to do it. Right?
Exactly. And I think this sort of brings us to the second story that was sort of happening. Anthropic basically came out and said Kimi is actually distilling their own models. And was trying to sort of lobby Washington and maybe the industry as a whole to basically say, put a stop to these open models. And that's what we're trying to get to. Don't put a stop to, we need every tool that's available.
Right.
And White House actually put out a very strong statement and basically said that, this is not how we work. This is a relatively technical topic, so I want to get your take on it before, we sort of pass judgment on where we should go.
The systemic distillation is what basically White House called out, right? And I mean, what that basically means is Anthropic had flagged some similar patterns with Moonshot and other, during the course of the year, which basically got the ban and all of those. And then things became very strict on these whole things. And they said, okay, we're not going to allow even the one of the largest open models like Kimi K3 to come in and do it. And that's what basically is not the right thing to happen. Right. So they need to allow those open source models to come in, and they need to relax these frontier models. They need to set up some coding benchmarks, which I'm sure all the enterprises already have it in the non-AI environment. Bring it to the AI environment, have some coding benchmarks to do it. And as I said previously, keep the difference between the marginal risk and the high risk, and get all the safety parameters evaluated, right? And then implement it in a step-by-step operation. That's the overall, I mean, I wish I could have a whiteboard and draw this whole flow chart, but then that's basically the incident that we spoke before. There was a gap, right? There was a gap between the benchmark and the reality, what happened. And that is the gap that you need to take away, and not really call it as use terms like hack or cyber attack and those kinds of things. I mean, it was pretty much a benchmark test that had to be done before, which was not done, and Hugging Face very quickly detected and contained it. So whether it's the larger companies or whether it's White House, everybody needs to look at this case study in a way saying, okay, there was a problem and it got detected and fixed pretty fast. How did it get fixed? And rather than saying no open models, that's what we're basically saying, right? So
Yep. No, and this idea of, Chinese labs or any open source for that matter, distilling Anthropic's models. The concept of distilling, I just want to spend 30 seconds on it because it's a really interesting
sure.
concept. They're not arguing, Anthropic is not saying that our IP was stolen or, our weights were stolen, which is
Correct.
how the model works.
Correct.
Distilling is basically figuring out, hey, how did you answer this question? And
Right.
I'm going to use the same process to answer the question, right? And
Correct.
this is trying to figure out how someone is doing something is a
Correct.
pretty old sort of system.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, we've used that
Yeah.
system in technology forever.
Exactly.
So
It's a reasoning
why is
pattern.
now
It's
distilling becoming a distillation attack, right?
correct. It's a reasoning pattern, right? It's the
Yep.
behavioral pattern, or as it's called, model distillation, or is it a knowledge distillation? So it's nothing that was not done before, right? It's
Right.
always being done. It's just that you're using the LLMs and the those models to right now do that. Other than that, it's basically a regular knowledge pattern which is getting trained, right? Which is being taught, and you're collecting the responses and retraining the model. That's the overall thing. So it shouldn't be taken in. Of course, as you said, if the data is not leaked, if the data is not hacked in a way, then we don't need to really worry and just detect it. And they did it exactly the way Hugging Face did it, at the help of Kimi, right? So
right.
I think that's I'm saying something which is crazy, that I'm glad this happened because of this incident. I would say that the enterprises should feel more confident that things like this can happen and things like this can be detected and fixed, right? So
absolutely. And knowing the difference, right? Where you have certain capabilities with frontier models that you cannot have with anything else. So you want to have them in your mix. But then again, they do come with some guardrails, some restrictions, not to mention the higher cost. And if you also have the open models in your arsenal, in your, having that arrow in your quiver as an example, you're able to switch over to those open source models if and when necessary, and the necessity could be lower cost. In this instance, the necessity was higher capability.
Absolutely. I mean, it would be so interesting. I mean, I'm going to throw something here, Dhaval, that it would be so interesting that if somebody from the listener has actually worked on this or actually been part of this and wants to join our podcast as a guest, how cool and how knowledgeable would that be, right? I mean, we basically should get somebody to come and talk who has been part of this whole process, right?
Absolutely. I would love that. Let's get someone from Hugging Face to come and, have a chat
seriously
with us.
Because we understand this, we've read about it, we've researched about it, we know about it. But then imagine somebody who was in Hugging Face doing this or been part of the strategy. There's a lot that we can learn from that, right? So
absolutely. And we're, as you said, we're looking at this as an example and trying to sort of emulate. So we want to understand their strategy and ideally implement it with the next 100 enterprises that are, that may face the same issue in the future.
Maybe there are examples like that, which the listeners can put it on the comments or DM us saying that, this, there's one more that we know like the similar, and this is what we did here, because that we want to hear more, we want to know more and cover that and bring it in our podcast, right? So this is,
I think the other thing to highlight is that the way this attack happened on Hugging Face, right? Where now we know after, all the research that has gone into this over the last week or so, that this was OpenAI's new model. And they're basically, preparing this model. So they were testing it, and it's in the sandbox. It doesn't have access to the open internet, but they were asking it to do certain things. And one of the things they asked is to see if they can pass this benchmark. And to achieve that, the first thing the model did is figured out how to get on the internet and how to access the open web.
Exactly.
So this is sort of a first instance of an attack like this. But once these models are released, which we know will happen over the next few months, few years,
Right.
Anyone can use these models, right? And have and create cyber attacks like this. So we want to learn how, we sort of develop a strategy to defend against those attacks.
You said it. I mean, to be specific, it was the 5.6 Sol, which is very capable, but they attacked the unreleased model, which basically was deliberately given some reduced, cyber refusals that would not stop certain attacks. And they exploited that on day zero, on the Sandbox proxy, as you said, and did it. So that's very important for a lesson for a lot of models also, that do you want to release it before going through the test and before, but those kind of trials that you have to do, because unless you release a model like that and unrelease it, how are you going to have users use it and give you a feedback? So it's you have to do it, and you have to go through certain risks like this. And I would put this under a marginal risk. Like you said, there was no data lost, and it was detected and contained very quickly. So it's a great example to talk about, and I would love to know more examples if somebody can bring it to us. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this was a case of friendly fire, but it teaches us a lot about how, cybersecurity needs to be updated and how we need to think about these threats.
Absolutely. And I think that would get us to the next topic on the earnings and infrastructure and cost. A lot of news in the recent past, right? With Microsoft and Amazon and Alphabet, primarily Google and Meta, everybody basically, all the hyperscalers basically getting their earnings and their thing. I mean, you want to throw some light on that? How the cost structure or the CapEx, how is all shifting, and what's the reality on those things?
Sure. I mean, the biggest news story was Google's, 82 year-on-year growth in their cloud business, right? And that is something, this is a huge business, and having a business this large grow this quickly is sort of unprecedented. It took everybody by surprise. Google announced that, with this, they're increasing the amount of infrastructure spending that they are planning for 2026. So that was the second bullet point.
Right.
So not only is this business super profitable, but they're going to spend even more money developing the business.
Yeah.
And as sort of the punchline, because they're doing this additional CapEx, they actually went cash flow negative for the first time. I mean, they have plenty of cash, so it's not like the business is, Google is going out of business. But going cash flow negative, even for one quarter, investors sort of saw that as a warning sign, and the stock sold off, right? After the earnings came out, the stock was down pretty significantly. So, we're seeing where the value is accruing. In the software side, we talked about, the Anthropic and OpenAI's models versus open source models like Kimi. But on the hardware side, the value is accruing very, very quickly to the Googles, to the XAIs, to the AWSs, because no matter what model you're running, you still need the infrastructure.
Correct.
You still need the hardware, right?
While everybody is focusing on the Copilots and the Gemini, I mean, it's so important to understand that as those grow in the user base, your Google Cloud and your Azure has to increase. The infrastructure increases, the cost increases, which is higher revenues for Google and Microsoft, right? Because you are basically getting, and that's the negative cash flow for a certain period of time, when you're basically getting your CapEx and your, your operating cash, burning that cash in a way, right? So to get the Azure and the Google Clouds ready for the higher usage of the Geminis and the Copilots, as an example, right? Same with Amazon and same with Meta and all those companies. So,
absolutely. And the only thing, I want to make a comment on why the stock went down. And obviously the company is at no risk. So why are investors frowning on this? The revenues are up, and the key business growing 82% year over year is unprecedented. Why did the stock go down? And I think it's because the investors are getting concerned about this infrastructure spend, right? Everybody is spending so much money on building out their AI infrastructure. Investors are worried that, hey, is this actually going to generate ROI in the long term, right? Like over the course of 5-10 years, are we going to get our, money back plus make additional profits?
Right.
And that's a concern we've seen pop up, over the last several months, because we're seeing this, crazy numbers like 800 billion, in CapEx being spent, over 200 billion being spent in one quarter. How is this money going to come back to the company? That is a question that everybody seems to be focused on.
Right. And it's not a difficult answer. In a very simplistic way, your revenues through the cloud usage, right, that you charge for AWS or Azure or Google GCP is one revenue, and all your licenses and usage of your copilots and the LLMs that you're doing. So the revenue models are multiple, right? And the entire FD deployment that we spoke about in one of our past videos, that's another source of your revenues from a services perspective, right? So I'm sure the investors are, learning a lot as things come, but then they have a immediate reaction to this in the near past and where the stocks fell down. Is how I look at it, right? Like we talk about how enterprises have to learn and do things. I think investors need to be, and I'm sure all these big companies are doing that for the investors also.
No,
they're doing
absolutely.
sessions for them and all that. So
yeah, I think starting to distinguish between hardware and software is sort of step one, right? Like, because we're saying, Gemini versus Google Cloud, what's the difference? If you're accruing revenue on one, you're accruing revenue on the other, and vice versa.
Right.
And it actually isn't as simple as that, because of the open source conversation we just had, right? Because when you say, okay, Gemini, we don't necessarily want to use it, or we don't want to pay additional expense for it. We want to switch over to Kimi. Okay. How are you going to run Kimi? Well, we have to have Kimi installed on our servers and run the servers for Kimi, right? So you may not necessarily rely on Google's AI offering. You still have to rely on Google's server to run open source models, as an example.
Correct. So you have the software component, you have the hardware stack, and then the big one is the power, right? Which is needed to run this whole thing, right? So those are the cost components. So the investors are concerned with the cash burn. I mean, these are the three major components which is taking all the money, right? So, but then the ROI of this is, I mean, I think at least people like us are super confident that there is going to be a huge ROI for this, right?
Yeah.
For all the investments being made.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is a sort of a long-term trend. The similarity, the comparison I keep seeing is, comparing it to sort of the late 1990s and the infrastructure build out for the internet. Right. And, a lot of fiber optic cables being laid across the world. And, a lot of companies who actually did that infrastructure build out went bankrupt because they projected, 1,000% growth. And in reality, it was only 100% growth. And even though 100% growth, everybody is super excited. It wasn't enough to sort of repay the initial investment in the time frame that it needed to be repaid. With that, I would actually, the biggest difference between that build out and the build out we're starting to see today is that the build out today, there is no dark fiber, right? I've mentioned this term before, that every single GPU that's turned on, that has the power, the cooling, the data center that can actually be turned on, is being turned on and is being fully utilized. That's a huge difference between fiber optic cable being laid and not being used, right? So I think that's a really, really important distinction that people have to remember, that, a ton of investments going in, but we're starting to see ROI almost immediately. As soon as those data centers come online, they're being utilized, they're being put to work. That's a huge difference from the past instances.
And there's a lot of work being done in even the routing layer, optimizing it for cost control, right? So it's not that that's not being worked on. So I think all the companies are pretty cognizant of the fact about the cost. Along with the ROI, they are also doing optimizations on the infrastructure to make sure that, it's not just
Let's
burning
talk
cash.
about the optimization a little bit more, because that routing is becoming so important. There have been, many different developments on how enterprises are doing this just in the last week, right? Tell us a little bit more about how you think about that.
I mean, take an example of Microsoft, right? We spoke about Microsoft MAI in one of our past podcasts, but then MAI is a classic example of the routing shift to the cheaper models, right? So so MAI is one example. There's pretty much multiple, even Anthropic is doing something similar. Google's doing something similar. So the overall, cursor router, right? There's one more. So
Cursor,
all of those
OpenRouter, there are several.
OpenRouter, right? So all of them are basically cost controlling tool, which are basically used to, routing to the cheaper models, right? Which basically reserves your capacity on the frontier models for the hardest tasks. So the simpler tasks are being done by the SLMs or the cheaper models, low cost, fast latency, low latency kind of models. And then the harder tasks are being routed to the frontier models. So that's in a very simplistic way. That's how they're doing it, and which does an overall benefit. I mean, it benefits the customer from the cost perspective, speed perspective, implementation cost perspective. And for these companies, it basically saves on their hardware cost on all of those aspects, right? So that's a big shift that has happened in the last few weeks and months. And we spoke about it, and I think that's
sort of a non-technical explanation. So hopefully it makes a little more sense. But, it's like, if you could hire just absolute genius in your company, right? Someone with 160 IQ, would you hire them? Of course. Yeah, right. We would, of course, hire as many of those people as we could get in our companies. Now, would you have them, answer the phones for customer service, or would you have them build Excel sheets or create PowerPoint presentations, or would you have them doing frontier R&D, develop the next greatest product that you can launch? The answer is obvious, right? Like if we're thinking in terms of human, we don't want to put them on the phone, right? We could hire someone else to do that. Let's have them do the breakthrough research. Until now, what we've been doing with these LLMs is essentially asking the LLMs, the 160 IQ software, to basically do that, right? Answer the phone, build the Excel sheet, build the PowerPoint presentation, and then maybe when you are free, do the breakthrough research. And what we're starting to see is now we can get some of these open source models or lower end models to do all of those other tasks and reserve the frontier model just for the breakthrough research. And by doing that, we're optimizing on cost, we're optimizing on the hardware, we're optimizing on latency, all the other factors you listed. I think that's a really, really important factor.
It's a great example.
This also gets into the Jevons paradox. I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but everybody is like, if we do this, won't OpenAI make less money, or won't Anthropic make less money? And the answer is no, right? This paradox basically says when something becomes cheaper, when optionality increases, people actually use more of it.
Correct.
So the revenues are still going up. They're maintaining. And it's not like these frontier labs are going out of business. It's just that now we as enterprise, customers, we have more optionality. We can do more with these tools that we have available.
No, this is great. The overall task routing, like the way you explained, was amazing. I just want to go one step into more fine tuning, which is you take the example of PowerPoint, right? Like you said, you don't need a high end model to do any of the PowerPoint work. But then within the PowerPoint, there are still minimal tasks or low value tasks like generating an image or coming up with something. So even you can make the entire task go to a lower model, or you can even fine tune the specific tasks within the activity to go for a lower model. That's how you basically do a fine tuning of the models. So that's and as you said, the cost or the revenues to the companies doesn't reduce because you start generating more images because of that, because it's not costing you much.
Exactly. Right. This is where SLMs come into play, right? And you can have specialized SLMs just for creating images, just for doing layout in PowerPoint presentation, just for the text aspect of, and combining all of that, having an orchestration layer to build the PowerPoint presentation.
Exactly.
That's a great analogy, right?
Cool. This is amazing. Anything else you want to cover on the CapEx infrastructure? I think we've covered quite a bit.
I think this ROI conversation is something that's going to come up over and over again. And I think every enterprise is thinking about their token spend. Just 3 months ago, we were talking about things like token maxing. Let's just spend as much as we can to figure out what the capabilities are. Now we're sort of pulling back from it and having this ROI conversation. Okay, how do we maximize the returns we're getting for this spend? And I think that's a shift we've seen in the last, this earnings season. But I think that's a conversation we're going to have, over and over for the next, at least a couple of quarters. And then it just becomes part of how we, build these tools and how we deploy these tools. So really interesting shift that we're seeing in enterprises. This earnings season. So really exciting.
Amazing. That was a great conversation, though. Great topics. Yeah.
Thank you for coming on. And
thank you.
Everybody, if you have questions for us, if you want us to dig into any of these topics a little bit more, please send us, comments on the video or reach out to us on LinkedIn or X. We'd love to start conversations, and make sure if you don't want to miss future conversations, make sure you subscribe and hit the little bell icon so that you get alerted when we release new videos. So with that, I think we'll wrap it up. Right?
Wrap it up. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Dhaval. Always pleasure talking.
Absolutely.